The visitor to Moscow's Red Square will see a statue of two men outside St. Basil's Cathedral. You've probably seen it yourself in many postcards. Most Western visitors do not know who these people are, but these two men are commemorated every year on Russia's National Day, November the 6th. They are celebrated because they brought an end to Polish and Swedish occupation of Russia, indeed of this very Red Square. They unified Russia at the end of a traumatic decade-long civil war known as the Time of Troubles. They brought to power the Romanov dynasty, who would last till 1917, and created a model of unrest. That is, the Time of Troubles created a model of unrest and state integration that still informs Russian elites today. That civil war, that time of troubles, was triggered by two mysterious murders of sons of Ivan the Terrible. What is the murder mystery at the centre of Russia's 17th century crisis? That is the question on today's Burning Archive. Welcome everyone to the Burning Archive. I am Jeff Rich and I am a writer, historian, podcaster, and now retired, one might say, almost redundant government official, no longer a government official, no longer constrained by those speech codes. And the Burning Archive podcast is my explorations of some of the more fascinating stories of history and culture that connect with the multipolar world we're encountering today. And today is a fascinating story. It's a fascinating story about Russia, which is part of my series responding to the black legend of Russian history, as outlined by Mark P. Smith in his wonderful book, The Russia Anxiety. And this one, after looking at Catherine the Great and the Russian Enlightenment last episode, this one goes back into the early 17th century and an extraordinary crisis that does in fact shape Russian history for quite some time afterwards, not least because it brings to power the Romanov dynasty, who would reign over Russia until 1917. And the most remarkable stories of history, I find at least, are often so much better than fiction. Truth really is stranger than fiction, they say, and that is certainly true of the Time of Troubles. The Time of Troubles, or the Smutnye Vremya in Russian, is the term, or sometimes known as the Smuta, is the term for the civil war that began in Russia in 1604, although some people set the date a little bit earlier, when a person claiming to be the rightful Tsar, the true son of Ivan the Terrible, who will be the focus of our podcast in the next episode, someone claiming to be the rightful Tsar, the true son of Ivan the Terrible, who people had believed had died in 1591. The son had died in 1591. This man claimed and sought to overthrow the then Tsar, a man known as Boris Godunov. You might have heard his name. There's a famous Mussorgsky opera about him. This man would come to be known to history, that is the man who claimed to be the rightful son and heir to the Russian throne, as False Dmitri, or the pretender Dmitri. And some friends of the podcast might have encountered False Dmitri wandering aimlessly through Azeroth from time to time, but otherwise, unless you've studied Russian history, you've probably never heard of this remarkable character who is truly fascinating, False Dmitri, or the pretender Dmitri. His and Boris Godunov's tragic fates are forever intertwined, and we'll find out why. as we go through the episode, but it does relate to those two mysterious murders of sons of Ivan the Terrible. The Smuta, or the Time of Troubles, began in 1604, but then it ended after a succession of short-lived claimants to the throne came and went. And after the two men celebrated in a Red Square, in that statue in front of St. Basil's Cathedral, Minin and Pazharsky unified the Russian people to expel the foreign invaders and the various rebels, and then installed the first Romanov Tsar, Mikhail Romanov. And just like civil wars in other countries, the Time of Troubles, the Smuta, is a source of unique national myths and political cultures. That is why it is commemorated on Russia's National Day. And I should say it's been commemorated on that day since the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union. Prior to that, of course, early November was the day for the commemoration of the October in the Russian calendar revolution. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation returned to the pre-1917 tradition of commemorating the national unification of Russia in the early 1600s as a result of the actions of Minin and Pazharsky. And it was under one of the imperial Tsarist regimes that extraordinary statue in front of St. Basil's was erected. The Time of Troubles involved a broad popular uprising in an autocratic country, so it has been invested with many, many loaded interpretations. In the Soviet era, it was interpreted as a peasant war, a kind of proto-revolution, and nationalist historians have read it as the result of the interference of Poland, Lithuania. In the 17th century, there was a large state based around Poland, I guess what's part of Eastern Germany, and Ukraine, which was known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, one of the more powerful states in Europe at that time. And some people at the time interpreted this civil war, this Time of Troubles, as God's judgment on Russia. It has been interpreted as a peasant war, as a Cossack revolt, as an outbreak of Ukrainian nationalism, and as an international Polish Jesuit conspiracy against Russia. It had long-term causes and short-term triggers. It had catastrophic consequences for Russia, devastating consequences for the Russian people. And yet, it also contains redemptive story arcs about some extraordinary personalities. Redemptive story arcs and tragic story arcs too. It features talented men who rose to become Tsar and murdered sons raised from the dead who claimed to be the true Tsar. And it involved an invasion of Russia launched through what is today Ukraine and was then Poland, Lithuania. Indeed, some of the early battles of the Russian Civil War of the 1600s, the Time of Troubles, occurred in areas where there have been battles in this last 12 months in the Russian-Ukrainian War. But most of all, this extraordinary story has some unanswerable enigmas at the heart of it, and some extraordinary human drama. It involved chaos, suffering, cruelty, sadness, and also comedy. And that most intriguing thing of all, a murder mystery, a whodunit. It is a story that should be more widely told outside of Russia. So let me tell you the story in 4 parts. There's the prologue, or the backstory, where we go from Ivan the Terrible, the extraordinary Tsar who ruled Russia from the 1530s to the 1580s. Ivan the Terrible killing his son, to Boris Godunov maybe killing Ivan's son. And then I will tell you the broad outline narrative of the Time of Troubles itself, which features some extraordinary backs and forths, but we'll boil it down and focus on the key character of the extraordinary false Dmitri. And then we'll have a look at the mystery of false Dmitri, the potentially strangest truth of all, that perhaps he was who he said he was. And then we'll look at the long-term effects of the Time of Troubles, including its impact on the establishment of the Romanov dynasty. So first the backstory, and here we have to look a little bit at the remarkable Tsar Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, or in Russian Ivan Grozny, which means something a little bit more like awe-inspiring, but also fear-inspiring, so terrible in some ways, who became Tsar, or the Grand Prince of Russia in the early 1530s as a young boy, and then would have a pretty tempestuous period in office until 1584 when he died. And I will go into a bit more detail about Ivan the Terrible in the next episode, but suffice to say for this part of the story that Ivan the Terrible was a complex and violent man. And by the end of his long reign, Russia had been involved in some long, protracted, and not terribly successful wars, some successful too, and also been involved in some terrible internal conflicts, hence his reputation for being terrible. And this had created quite an economic and fiscal crisis in Russia. Basically, there was the place was a wreck. He also left a succession crisis. He had multiple sons, Ivan, Fyodor, and Dmitri, and he had also had 6 or maybe 7 wives. I think it might be 7, even better than his near contemporary Henry VIII. In 1581, Ivan killed his eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, and there's a dramatic painting painted in the 19th century of Ivan looking remorseful after having struck his son with a staff and realizing, what has he done? His second son, Fyodor, was sickly, pious, and in most accounts speculatively mentally retarded or intellectually disabled, perhaps might be a better way of putting it, maybe as a result of some kind of childhood disease. He was not good Tsar material. And the youngest son, Dmitri, was the son of Ivan's 6th wife, which in the eyes of the Orthodox Church was a couple of marriages too many, Maria Nagoya. And so, according to church law, Dmitri was really an illegitimate child, or at least a suspect in relationship to his claim to the throne. On Ivan the Terrible's death in 1584, Fyodor became Tsar. But given his character, there was a power struggle among the elite and the powerful advisors. On one side were the clans related to Ivan's 6th wife and his quite youngest child, Dmitri. And their opponents were a group led by a talented and effective boyar or lord known as Boris Godunov, who I mentioned earlier. And there were 2 other key members of this group. One was Fyodor Nikitich Romanov, that name of the dynasty, and another man called Vasily Shuisky, whose family we will encounter again. who were, with Godunov, part of a regency council established by Ivan IV, given he knew his son Fyodor was not quite up to the job. Godunov had one great advantage in this power struggle. His sister, Irina, had been the childhood playmate of Tsar Fyodor and was now his wife. So she then was the Tsarina. Smart, educated, and sophisticated, she exercised significant influence over Fyodor, and for a time while Fyodor was Tsar, she was co-regent. Arguably, she was Russia's first female Tsar. Indeed, for a brief period after Fyodor's death, she was, in fact, Russia's first female Tsar. But she had married late, and the couple were infertile. Given Fyodor's other problems, it might have been his fault. But so it was not until 1592, when she was 35, did she bear a child, a young girl who sadly died within 2 years. There was no male heir. Her brother, Boris Godunov, became regent and de facto ruler of Russia in 1586 after the Fyodor Romanov's death. But many of the factions and the various power groups, the elites we might say, resented his influence, given he had no real dynastic claim to the throne. He was a talented man who had made good and had perhaps bruised a few egos along the way. So this created a terribly unstable situation. And the rival group, related to the Nagoya clan, related to Ivan the Terrible's sixth wife, Maria or Marfa Nagoya, had been sent away from court, including with Ivan's son, Dmitri, to a town about 100 or so kilometres away from Moscow called Uglitch. Then, and here we start to get to the core murder mystery at the heart of the time of troubles. Then, in 1591, a strange murder mystery at the heart of this story happens. Dmitri appears to be killed. And I say appears here advisedly. Maria Nagoya accuses, that is Ivan the Terrible's wife, Maria Nagoya, mother of Dmitri, accuses Godunov, Boris Godunov, of assassinating him. There is an investigation that dismisses this accusation and finds that Dmitri stabbed himself in the midst of an epileptic fit, during which he inconveniently had a dagger in his hand. There were some irregularities with the funeral, but on the whole, despite a few protests in Uglitch, people moved on. In the meantime, Boris Godunov continued to rule as regent and was doing quite a good job in rather trying circumstances. He did so well, indeed, that by 1598, when the sickly Fyodor died, he managed to get himself elected Tsar. Quite a feat. Perhaps the only Tsar who was so elected in Russian history. In particular, Boris Godunov expanded and put up defensive fortresses, especially to the south of Moscow, so down towards what we now think of as Crimea and eastern Ukraine, the Donbass. He in fact founded cities like Voronezh in the Don and the Volga sort of areas as well. He fought quite effectively against the Swedes, the Turks, and the Crimean Tatars, and the large groups of bandits or Cossacks who were quite common in the area south near the Don, the Volga, and what we now know as the Donbass and central or eastern Ukraine. This was a rather complex area. And it was also an area where a lot of people were fleeing because of the economic problems in Russia.